After 5 years of a trying marriage, Eleanor Vance had failed to carry a child to term. Now pregnant for the fourth time, she accidentally discovered a strange perfume on her husband's jacket and an unusual setting in his car. Slowly, she uncovered that her husband was cheating on her with a young, pregnant woman who had the full support of his family. Worse still, a hidden camera revealed that her mother-in-law was the mastermind behind it all. The climax came with her husband's accidental confession of his complicity with his mother in exchange for a male heir to carry on the family legacy. What did Eleanor Vance do? How did she manage to turn the tables? And how will this fascinating story unfold? After 3 miscarriages, the wife secretly placed a camera in a vase, and the recorded footage left her frozen in horror. 5 years of marriage, and Eleanor Vance had been on the gynecologist's examination table countless times. But this was the first time she had felt such intense hope. She was already in her 4th month, and the fetus in her womb was developing steadily. It was a miracle after 3 painful losses. James Parker, her husband, couldn't join her as usual, citing an urgent meeting, but he had called, giving her detailed instructions in a voice as warm and loving as when they first met. Eleanor smiled, telling herself that as long as the baby was safe, all her sacrifices were worth it. She drove herself back to their sprawling home in Westchester County, just outside of New York City. Considered the happy home of the young CEO and the talented interior designer, everything would have remained a picture-perfect image if she hadn't decided to go to the underground parking garage first. While James went to throw away some empty water bottles, she opened the passenger door, intending to recline the seat a bit to rest. But as she sat down, her knee bumped uncomfortably against the glove compartment. Eleanor paused. A strange feeling crept into her mind. She was nearly 5'7", and 4 months pregnant. She always had the habit of pushing the seat all the way back for maximum space. But the current distance, so tight and confined, was clearly not for her. It seemed to fit a woman of a much smaller build perfectly. In a fleeting instant, a conclusion as sharp as a knife cut through Eleanor's heart. Another woman had been sitting in this seat. A petite woman, no taller than 5'3", had been in her husband's car, right in the position that belonged only to her. James had no close female friends. This she knew very well. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to quell the tremor rising from the depths of her soul. She silently adjusted the seat back to her original position. A few minutes later, James got into the car, leaned over, and gently placed his hand on her belly, saying in a loving voice, "Daddy's little darling, were you good today? What did the doctor say, my love?" Eleanor forced the corners of her lips into a smile. Her voice was calm. "He's very healthy. All the tests are fine." She turned her face to the window, pretending to admire the passing scenery to hide the look in her eyes that had already turned complex. That evening, after dinner, James received a call and hurried into his home office. Eleanor finished cleaning up, passed by the laundry room, and saw the jacket he had just taken off. Unconsciously, she picked it up, and a strange, sweet, yet unfamiliar scent hit her nose. It was the ethereal aroma of gardenia, a woman's perfume, definitely not the one she used. Eleanor's heart plunged into an abyss. The seat position could have been accidentally adjusted by the car wash attendant, but for this perfume, there was no other reasonable explanation. She stood motionless in the laundry room. The designer jacket in her hand suddenly felt heavy. The home office door opened, and James came out. Seeing her standing there, he smiled and came to hug her from behind. His voice was still as warm as a summer day. "Why are you standing here, honey? I'm done with work. Let's go to bed soon. We have to take care of our baby's health, too." His embrace sent a chill down her spine. She gently pushed him away, trying to keep her voice as steady as possible, looking him straight in the eye. "James, your jacket smells like a strange perfume." James paused slightly. A flicker of confusion crossed his eyes, so fast that if you weren't looking closely, you wouldn't notice. He immediately brought the jacket to his nose. Then he laughed naturally. "Oh, I forgot to tell you, I met with Mrs. Thompson, our business partner, this afternoon to discuss the new contract. It must have rubbed off on me by accident. You women are so sensitive, really." He explained it perfectly, seamlessly, even joking with her intimately. But Eleanor Vance couldn't smile. She knew Mrs. Thompson, a woman in her 50s who was always distant and extremely professional. It was impossible for her to wear such a youthful perfume, let alone for the scent to cling so intensely by accident. A crack had appeared in the wall of trust she had built over the past 5 years. That night, lying next to her husband, who slept soundly with even breaths, Eleanor couldn't fall asleep. She stared at the dark ceiling, feeling enveloped in loneliness and fear. The worst nightmare wasn't the darkness, but realizing that the light she had trusted for so long was just an elaborate play. The next morning, Eleanor Vance woke up with slight dark circles under her eyes, but with a strange calm on her face. She didn't cry or make a scene. 3 losses had taught her one thing: agitation and weakness solved no problems and could, in fact, harm the child she was protecting at all costs. James had already prepared breakfast, a bowl of hot oatmeal and some simple side dishes she liked. He helped her to her seat affectionately, serving her food. Every action exuded the consideration of a perfect husband. He looked at her with some concern. "What's wrong? Didn't you sleep well last night, or are you overthinking things?" The doctor said the mother's mood greatly affects the baby. The words of concern sounded like a subtle warning in Eleanor's ears, as if telling her that her suspicions were due to her oversensitivity, that it was her fault. Eleanor smiled faintly, bringing a spoonful of oatmeal to her mouth. "It's nothing, honey. Just the baby kicking a lot lately, making it hard to sleep. You eat before it gets cold." She knew that confronting him directly would only result in better prepared lies. Trust is like paper. Once crumpled, no matter how hard you try to smooth it out, it will never be the same again. She needed proof, irrefutable proof, to know what kind of man she had shared her bed with for 5 years. After breakfast, Eleanor told James she wanted to go to the mall to buy some maternity clothes and some items for the baby. James immediately wanted to go with her, but she tactfully refused. "I want to pick out some things for our little one by myself. You go to the office, I can drive, I'll be careful." Seeing his wife's determination, James didn't insist, only telling her to be careful before leaving. But Eleanor's destination was not the bustling mall but an electronics store tucked away on a side street in Queens. She walked into a store specializing in recording equipment with a firm, clear voice. "I need the best hidden camera with a long-lasting battery that connects directly to a phone." The salesman looked at the sophisticated-looking pregnant woman before him, didn't ask many questions, and quickly handed her a tiny device the size of a pinky fingernail tip. Returning home, Eleanor went straight to the living room. She looked around, her eyes stopping on the large vase of hydrangeas placed on a wooden side table in the corner. It was her favorite flower and also a gift James gave her on every anniversary. Her hands trembled slightly, but her movements were decisive. She carefully placed the micro camera among the dense blossoms, aiming the lens to cover the entire living room, where the sofa and the front door were clearly visible. A strange feeling washed over her. A bit of guilt for invading privacy, but also the cold determination of someone seeking justice. Once everything was done, Eleanor sat on the sofa, silently looking at the hydrangea vase. The flowers were still vibrant, a soft blue, but now, in her eyes, they had become a silent witness. The hidden camera inside was like the eye of a god, about to pull back the velvet curtain of the happiness play to reveal the raw and perhaps devastating truth hidden within. She didn't know what she would face, but she was sure of one thing. She couldn't live in deceit for another day. For the next 2 days, Eleanor Vance lived in a state of high alert. She pretended to work in her home design studio, but her mind and eyes were glued to her phone screen, which displayed the live feed from the hidden camera in the hydrangea vase. The house remained quiet. James continued to leave early and return late, calling her from time to time with sweet words. Everything was so normal that Eleanor sometimes wondered if she was being overly suspicious. But on the afternoon of the 3rd day, the peaceful charade was torn apart. James came home for lunch, which was quite unusual. After eating, he sat in the living room, believing his wife was napping upstairs. James took out his phone, and his usually composed face became strangely tender and loving. He dialed a number. His voice deepened, with a tone Eleanor had never heard before. "Yes, it's me. Have you eaten yet? Remember to eat well. Don't skip meals. It's not good for our little treasure." Eleanor's heart clenched. Our little treasure. He called another child treasure too. He said a few more comforting words, promising something about a not-too-distant future before hanging up. The evidence of infidelity was as clear as day. But before that pain could settle in, an even more terrifying nightmare befell her. At that moment, the doorbell rang. His mother, Carol Parker, came in carrying an insulated food container, a radiant smile on her face. She said warmly to her son, "James, you're home? I brought some homemade chicken soup for Eleanor. I've noticed she's been looking very pale lately. She needs to eat well so my grandson will be strong and smart." James got up to greet her with a filial expression. "Why did you go to so much trouble, Mom? Worrying about her every day." Eleanor, who was upstairs, heard their voices. She took a deep breath, mentally preparing herself for the scene about to unfold. She heard Carol say, "Call your wife down to have it while it's hot." As James went upstairs, Carol was left alone in the living room. She carefully opened the container, pouring the steaming, fragrant soup into a white porcelain bowl. Thinking no one was watching, she turned, glanced around quickly, and then her next action made Eleanor Vance, who was witnessing everything through her phone screen, feel her blood run cold. Carol took a small, unmarked paper packet from her purse, skillfully tore it open, and poured all the white powder inside into the bowl of soup. She stirred it gently with the spoon until the powder dissolved completely. All her movements were extremely calm, as if this was something she had done countless times. The phone almost slipped from Eleanor's trembling hand. She had to cover her mouth with her other hand to keep from screaming in horror. The nourishing soup, the love from her mother-in-law, turned out to be a perfectly disguised poisoned potion. The 3 previous miscarriages, the gut-wrenching pain, the times she had blamed herself for not being careful, it all came rushing back with sudden clarity. It turned out it hadn't been her fault or fate, but a ruthless, premeditated conspiracy, a conspiracy from the person she had always respected and called Mom. Just then, James's footsteps were heard outside the bedroom door, followed by his voice. "Honey, Mom brought you soup. Get up and have some while it's hot." Eleanor quickly turned off the phone screen, trying to regulate her breathing. She turned to face her husband, forcing a weak smile. But downstairs, Carol's voice rang out, clear and full of love. A voice that now sounded like the call of death. "Eleanor, come down and have some hot soup. I've been simmering it for you all morning." Eleanor Vance felt a shiver run down her spine, but on her face, she struggled to maintain her composure. She leaned on James's arm, slowly walking down the stairs, each step like treading on broken glass. Carol was sitting on the sofa. Seeing her daughter-in-law, she stood up hastily, holding the bowl of steaming soup, and said with a smile, "Come on, my dear, come and sit down, have it while it's hot. After this bowl, you'll be as strong as an ox." Eleanor took the bowl. Her hands trembled intentionally, as if she were deeply moved, and her palms were covered in cold sweat. She couldn't drink that soup, but she couldn't refuse it directly without arousing suspicion either. An idea flashed through her mind. As she turned to go to the dining table, her foot accidentally tripped on the edge of the rug. She let out a cry, and her whole body stumbled forward. The soup in her hands flew out, splashing all over the marble floor, and the bowl shattered into pieces. The strong smell of chicken soup filled the space. Carol and James rushed to her side at the same time, but their concerns were completely different. Carol, distressed, checked her hands and legs, her voice full of pity. "Oh my goodness, are you okay? Did you get burned?" Meanwhile, James looked at the mess on the floor and blurted out a complaint. "Why are you so clumsy? Mom's soup that she worked so hard on is all spilled." Eleanor lowered her head, her voice filled with remorse and fear. I'm sorry, Mom. It wasn't on purpose. I guess I just felt a little dizzy." The moment Carol turned to get a cloth, Eleanor, quick as lightning, used a clean tissue she had hidden in her jacket pocket to absorb a bit of the spilled soup from an area with fewer broken shards and discreetly tucked it back into her pocket. That afternoon, under the pretext of meeting a client to discuss building materials, Eleanor drove to a private testing lab hidden in the city center. She handed the tissue sample to the technician, requesting an analysis of all components, especially substances harmful to pregnant women. Leaving the lab, she didn't go home immediately but drove to a quiet coffee shop. Sitting in a secluded corner, she took a deep breath and dialed a phone number she hadn't contacted in a long time. The other line picked up quickly, a deep, warm, male voice. "This is Richard." Eleanor tried to keep her voice steady. "It's Eleanor Vance, Richard. I'm sorry to bother you, but I really need some help." Richard Mendez, the talented lawyer and her mentor from college. There was a silence for a few seconds. Then he replied, his tone calm but filled with concern. "Eleanor, it's me. What's wrong? You don't sound good." His reassuring tone made her eyes well up. She spoke briefly. "I have a very serious problem with my marriage, and I need advice from a lawyer I can absolutely trust." Without hesitation, Richard replied immediately, his voice firm and full of confidence. "Okay, Eleanor, calm down. Don't say anything over the phone. Where are you? Send me the address. I'll be there right away." She hung up. Eleanor looked out the window. The afternoon sun in New York filtered through the glass, tinging the space gold, but she felt no warmth. Instead, in her heart, there was a cold, terrifying clarity. She was no longer a wife suffering from betrayal, nor a daughter-in-law in a panic. At this moment, she was a mother, a warrior, initiating the battle to protect her child's life and demand justice for herself. After James and his mother left, the house returned to a suffocating silence. Eleanor Vance stood motionless in the middle of the living room, staring at the spot where the liquid had been wiped from the floor. The scene earlier had been too perfect. Carol's concern, James's reproach, it all fit together rhythmically, turning her into an insensitive person who didn't appreciate her mother-in-law's kindness. If it hadn't been for the camera, she probably would have believed she was the one at fault, that she was being unreasonably suspicious. Carol was truly a talented actress. She hadn't been angry at all, only showing pity and worry. That false affection was 1,000 times more terrifying than any insult. She had held her hand, rubbing it gently, her eyes full of tenderness. "It's okay, dear. You spilled it. It's no big deal. As long as you're okay, I'm happy. I simmered it since early this morning. I picked the best chicken. I put in so many nourishing herbs, all just so you and the baby will be healthy. If anything happened to you, how could I face this family?" Every word from her was like an invisible needle pricking every nerve in Eleanor. She constantly talked about her grandson and his health, but her actions had been to pour poisonous powder into the soup. This disgusting contradiction made Eleanor feel nauseous. James, standing on the side, seeing his mother's distressed expression, turned to his wife with a frown. "Eleanor, look at yourself. Mom is getting older, and she comes all the way from her house every day to take care of you. Can't you be a little more careful? You need to appreciate her kindness. Don't make her feel bad." He said those words as naturally as if he truly believed his mother was a wonderful person and she was a useless daughter-in-law. Eleanor suddenly realized they weren't just accomplices, they were a perfect team. One acted, the other reinforced the belief, weaving a sweet trap together. Eleanor lowered her head, her shoulders trembling slightly, her voice choked with regret. "Yes, I know I was wrong. I'm sorry, Mom. I really appreciate your kindness. It's just that I've been feeling dizzy lately and can't walk steadily. It really wasn't intentional." Seeing her appearance, James's expression softened a bit, and Carol quickly waved her hand, continuing her role as the magnanimous mother-in-law. "It's okay, I don't blame you. All pregnancies are tiring. Go upstairs and rest. I'll clean up here." Before leaving, Carol didn't forget to hold Eleanor's hand and say affectionately, "I'll cook you another, even more nourishing bowl tomorrow, okay? Remember to take good care of yourself. Don't overthink things. Got it?" Eleanor nodded obediently, seeing her mother-in-law to the door, watching the shadow of her car disappear behind the iron gate. The moment the door closed, the weak smile and remorseful expression on Eleanor's face vanished instantly, replaced by a coldness and sharpness like ice. The play was over, and she had survived another scene. This house, the home she had strived to build, was now no different from a horror stage where she was both the spectator and the lead actress in the play of her own life. From that day on, Eleanor Vance became even more cautious. She used the excuse of morning sickness to refuse all the food and drinks her mother-in-law brought. She knew that as long as she was in that house, danger lurked everywhere. She was just waiting for the lab results and the right moment to launch her counterattack. And the opportunity came faster than she expected. On Saturday afternoon, Eleanor told James she had an appointment for prenatal yoga and dinner with some friends and would probably be back late. James readily agreed, even encouraging her to go out for a distraction. But Eleanor didn't go anywhere. She just drove to a coffee shop near her house and sat there. Her phone was always in camera viewing mode. About half an hour after she left, the phone screen lit up, reporting movement in the living room. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She saw James open the door and walk in, and behind him was none other than a young woman. The girl was wearing an immaculate white dress. Her long black hair fell over her shoulders. Her delicate face had large, round eyes. She looked both innocent and pitiful. Eleanor instantly recognized the gardenia perfume that had clung to her husband's jacket the other day. It was undoubtedly hers. James took the girl's hand, pulling her to sit on the same sofa where the two of them sat to watch TV every night. The young woman looked around the exquisitely designed home, her voice clear but not hiding her envy and longing. "This is the house you share with that woman? It's really beautiful. She must be very happy." James hugged her, stroking her hair, his voice full of promises. "Soon it will be our house. Yours, mine, and our son's." Eleanor clenched the phone in her hand. Our son. So that was the reason for all this cruelty and lies. The girl, who must be Sophia Miller, snuggled into James's lap with a worried expression. She gently touched her still flat stomach, her voice coquettish. "James, I'm still worried. She won't let you go so easily. I don't want our son to be born without a proper name, pointed at by people." James laughed, a confident and cruel laugh Eleanor had never seen. He leaned close to Sophia's ear and whispered, but loud enough for the camera to record clearly, "Don't worry. Everything is within my mother's and my plan. Didn't everything go smoothly the previous times? Just a little more time. Something will happen to her on its own. By then, you and our son will enter this house with full rights. Something will happen to her." Those 5 words stabbed into Eleanor's heart like a dagger, leaving her breathless. So the previous miscarriages had been the masterpieces of the mother and son. It wasn't just about getting rid of unwanted babies. It was part of a larger plan. A plan to get rid of her. After those whispers, James leaned in and kissed Sophia on the lips, a long, deep kiss. They kissed passionately on her sofa, in her own home. Eleanor silently turned off the screen. The extreme pain was now replaced by another emotion, a cold, burning rage. They wanted something to happen to her? Very well. She would make sure something big happened, but the one who would suffer the consequences would definitely not be her. 2 days later, Eleanor Vance received the call from the testing lab. The professional voice of the technician on the other end of the line was monotonous, emotionless, but to Eleanor it was the sound of a verdict. She drove to the center, her heart pounding in her chest. Although she was mentally prepared, although she had witnessed it with her own eyes, she needed an official document, irrefutable scientific proof, to confirm that her nightmare was real. The technician handed her a carefully sealed envelope. Her hands were icy as she took it, feeling like she was holding her own destiny. She didn't open it right there. She went back to her car, closed the door, creating a private, safe space for herself. Taking a deep breath, she tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper filled with scientific terminology, but her eyes locked onto the conclusion at the bottom of the page. The bold, clear sentence hit her like a hammer. Qualitative analysis detected the presence of a high level of an active compound extracted from saffron, a substance with a strong ability to cause uterine contractions. If accumulated over time in pregnant women, it can lead to bleeding, fetal distress, and miscarriage. The test report slipped from her hand, landing on the empty passenger seat. Eleanor sat frozen, trembling. So it was true. It was all true. Her mother-in-law's loving soup was a slow-acting abortifacient, subtly dosed to cause a miscarriage that looked like a natural accident. Her 3 lost children, 3 little lives that never had a chance to form, had been murdered by the very grandmother they never got to meet. Pain and outrage rose like a tsunami, submerging her in despair. Tears began to fall, not the weak tears of fear, but the hot tears of extreme rage. She cried for her innocent children. She cried for the 5 years of youth and love she had devoted to an accomplice to a crime. She cried for her own stupidity in trusting a family that showed her affection on the outside but conspired to destroy her on the inside. They not only wanted to steal her assets but also her right to be a mother, and even her life. After a long sob, Eleanor slowly calmed down. She bent down and picked up the report, folding it carefully and putting it in her purse. This fragile piece of paper was no longer just a piece of evidence. It was her weapon. It was the sword of justice that would vindicate her honor and avenge her lost children. The weakness had completely disappeared, leaving only an iron will. They had turned her from a wife and mother into a warrior. And once a warrior goes to battle, they would have to pay for every tear, every drop of blood she shed. The next morning, Eleanor Vance was in Richard Mendez's law office. She placed a USB drive and the original copy of the lab results on his desk. The air in the room grew heavy. When Richard saw the video of Carol putting the powder in the soup, his face darkened. Then he read the lab results. Surprise and outrage were evident in his eyes. He looked up at Eleanor. The woman in front of him, though haggard, had a strangely firm gaze. His voice became deep and serious. "Eleanor, do you know what this is? This is no longer a civil divorce case. This is an act of intentional and systematic battery. Repeatedly, it could constitute attempted murder. This level of cruelty is unimaginable." Eleanor nodded. Her voice was as cold as ice. "I know. That's why I came to you. I want them to pay the highest possible price." Richard pondered for a moment, tapping his finger gently on the table. He analyzed professionally. "Our evidence is very solid, but to completely take them down in court, especially to expose Carol's true face, we need to understand her motive. Such a cruel act can't come from ordinary hatred. There must be a deeper reason. I suggest we hire a private investigator to thoroughly investigate Carol's past. Any information, no matter how small, can become a decisive weapon." Trusting Richard's judgment completely, Eleanor agreed immediately. Just a few days later, the private investigator sent a confidential file to Richard. He called her to his office. In the familiar room, Richard pushed the file toward her. Eleanor opened it. Inside were yellowed documents and a detailed report. She read, and a shocking secret buried for decades was exposed. Carol, before marrying James's father, had a first marriage and a son. The boy's name was Jamie, and he died at the age of 5 due to an incurable congenital heart defect. The report also attached statements from old neighbors. They recounted that after her first son's death, Carol had changed. She became obsessed with health, with the word legacy. She constantly talked about having a healthy, perfect grandson to carry on the family name. All the scattered pieces fit together perfectly in Eleanor's mind. Her mother-in-law's sick obsession was the source of the whole tragedy. She didn't hate her. She simply saw her as barren ground, unable to produce the golden seed she desired. Her 3 miscarriages weren't accidents, but failed purifications in her eyes. And Sophia Miller, with her promised male pregnancy, was the new fertile ground she had chosen, the hope for a perfect grandson by her insane standards. Eleanor closed the file. A sense of disgust and bitterness welled up in her chest. She was not the victim of simple hatred, but of a decades-long sick obsession, a madness covered by the disguise of affection. Understanding this didn't lessen her pain, but it made her goal clearer than ever. She knew what kind of monster she was facing. After discovering her mother-in-law's sick obsession, Eleanor Vance understood that James couldn't have been unaware. Such an obsessed mother could not have perfectly hidden all the clues from her only son, on whom she pinned all her hopes. James's silence was complicity. But knowing was one thing, and having proof was another. To make it impossible for him to deny it in court, she needed a confession from his own mouth. She decided to set a trap, a warm, false family gathering. Richard helped her arrange a key character for this trap. Eleanor told James she wanted to host a small party at home to celebrate her new project, that she had just signed a successful contract, and also to make up for her recent volatile mood. James, of course, was delighted. He thought his wife had finally come to her senses, putting aside her suspicions. He invited a few close friends, including Tony, whom he considered his best friend, not knowing that Tony was the person Richard had infiltrated. The party went on in a cheerful atmosphere. Eleanor played the role of the exemplary wife to perfection, constantly serving food and wine to her husband and his friends. When she saw that James was dizzy from the alcohol, Eleanor excused herself, saying she was tired and needed to rest upstairs, leaving the space for the men. Before leaving, she discreetly turned on the recorder of an old phone she had placed on a nearby bookshelf. Downstairs, after a few more drinks, Tony began to steer the conversation according to the script carefully prepared by Richard. He patted James on the shoulder with a sympathetic tone. "Hey man, Eleanor seems tired lately, doesn't she? Looks like this pregnancy is harder than the previous ones. You have to take good care of her. You don't want another accident to happen." James, already drunk, sighed, letting out a litany of complaints. "What do you know? There's so much pressure. It's not fun. So much hope, then so much disappointment. I'm exhausted." Tony lit a cigarette, took a long drag, and said casually, "Or maybe she's just not compatible with your family? I see your mom is very worried. She's always asking you about a grandson." This sentence struck a nerve with James. He grabbed the wine bottle, poured himself a full glass, and downed it in one go. His voice became slurred but full of bitterness. He leaned close to Tony and whispered, but just loud enough for the phone to record everything. "My mom, she just wants what's best for me. She has her ways. I knew about the previous times, but what could I do? Anyway, they were just unformed fetuses. Letting them go isn't a big deal either. As long as I get a healthy son, any sacrifice is worth it." That cold, cruel confession came out of his mouth smoothly, as if it were an undeniable truth. He knew everything, but had chosen to remain silent and accept his mother's crime. A few minutes after Tony left, Eleanor's phone received an audio file. She put on her headphones, lying in bed, silently listening to every word from her husband, whom she had once loved with all her life. That familiar voice now sounded strange and disgusting. The last illusion, the last glimmer of hope that he might have just been deceived, had completely vanished. He was not just a cheating husband. He was a cold-blooded accomplice, willing to sacrifice his own children to satisfy his selfishness and his family's obsession. In the darkness, a single, ice-cold tear rolled down Eleanor's cheek. It was no longer warm. With all the irrefutable evidence in her hands, the video of Carol poisoning, the lab results, the photos of James and Sophia being intimate in her own house, and finally, the audio of his confession, Eleanor Vance felt a strange calm. She had suppressed the pain and outrage, transforming them into a detailed and decisive plan of action. This was not the time for weakness, but for reclaiming everything that belonged to her and her child. The first and most important step was to secure her financial independence so that after leaving this hell, she and her child could live a stable life without depending on anyone. She had another meeting with Richard Mendez, not to cry or vent, but to discuss strategy. She laid out her thoughts lucidly and logically. Richard listened to her with admiration in his eyes. He didn't expect this seemingly fragile woman to have such a strong spirit and a clear mind. With his advice, Eleanor began to act secretly and swiftly. She started requesting statements for all joint bank accounts, collecting receipts and documents to prove which assets had been purchased with her premarital funds. Most importantly, she decided to regain control of her interior design firm, Aura Interior Design, which she had founded herself. Years ago, after getting married and being persuaded by James to retire to focus on the family, she had trusted him and transferred most of the company's stock and operational control to him. It was the biggest mistake of her career. Now was the time to correct it. Based on a clause in the transfer agreement that Richard had pointed out, Eleanor had the first right to buy back the stock if the transferee engaged in acts that damaged the company's reputation and interests. James's infidelity and dark conspiracies, once exposed, would undoubtedly be a fatal blow to the prestige of the Aura Interior Design brand. Eleanor used her savings and private investments to quietly carry out the legal procedures for buying back the stock. Everything was done confidentially through Richard and intermediaries, without James's knowledge. He was still absorbed in his plans, thinking his wife was just a meek little lamb. He didn't know that this lamb was reclaiming the entire forest, step by step. Meanwhile, at home, she remained a sweet wife, a pregnant woman in need of care. She continued to smile at her husband, continued to thank her mother-in-law, but behind that smile was a mind calculating every move. The contrast between her outward appearance and her internal actions created immense pressure, but it also made her sharper than ever. Every day that passed, she felt a little stronger, like a sword being sharpened in the fire. Finally, the day came. Eleanor sat in Richard Mendez's office, putting her pen to the last page of the transfer file. From that moment on, Aura Interior Design, her brainchild, had officially returned to the hands of its true owner. She looked at her signature on the paper. It wasn't just a name, it was the strongest declaration of independence. She had built her fortress, accumulated enough supplies and weapons. Now she was completely ready to throw open the door of that rotten castle and make those living inside pay the price. Once she had all the key cards in her hand, Eleanor Vance decided not to confront James and his mother directly. She understood that a criminal alliance built on deceit and greed was also extremely fragile. The smartest blow was not to attack the strongest brain, but to hit the weakest link and make them devour each other. And the weakest link in their plan was none other than Sophia Miller, the young mistress dreaming of a luxurious future. Through the private investigator, getting Sophia's phone number was not difficult. Eleanor sent her a short but powerful text message. "Hello, Sophia. This is Eleanor Vance. I think we have some things to clear up. Let's meet once, for the sake of both our futures." Sophia, after some hesitation, finally agreed. She probably thought it was a negotiation or a jealousy scene from the defeated wife, an opportunity to assert her position of true love. They arranged to meet at an elegant coffee shop, with enough privacy but also crowded enough to prevent any impulsive acts. Eleanor arrived first, choosing a corner table. She wore an elegant maternity dress, lightly made up, with the air of a true matriarch. When Sophia walked in, Eleanor observed her calmly. The girl was indeed young and beautiful, but in her eyes there was a mix of self-assurance and defiance. Sophia sat down opposite, crossed her arms over her chest, and began with a condescending tone. "Why did you call me? If it's to ask me to stay away from James, I advise you to save your breath." Eleanor didn't get angry, she just smiled faintly. A smile that Sophia found incomprehensible. She didn't talk about infidelity or mention James. Instead, she slowly placed her latest sonogram photo on the table, the image of a small life growing in her womb. Her voice became low, with a distant sadness. "Sophia, this is my 4th pregnancy. I assume you know James and I have been married for 5 years. She gently pushed the photo toward Sophia and continued to speak. Her voice was monotonous, but each word carried the weight of 1,000 pounds. The previous 3 times, the babies didn't stay with me. They left when they were only 3 or 4 months old. You're going to be a mother too. You must understand how sacred the feeling of waiting for a child is. And maybe you can also imagine how terrible the pain of losing one is." Eleanor didn't raise her voice, didn't reprimand her. She simply recounted her story, but that very calmness had a terrifying power of damage. Sophia's expression began to change. The self-assured smile on her lips hardened, replaced by confusion. She wasn't stupid. Eleanor's words hit her like a lightning bolt, forcing her to connect the dots. 3 unexplained miscarriages. A mother-in-law who always talked about a male heir. And now, the subtle appearance of the legal wife. An invisible fear began to envelop Sophia. Eleanor noticed the change, stood up, picked up her purse, and ended the conversation. "I just wanted you to know that. I wish you and your child good luck." Eleanor turned and left, leaving Sophia frozen in the coffee shop. The winner's confidence had completely vanished, replaced by the panic of someone who had just realized she was walking into a deadly trap. She suddenly realized that the family she was trying to enter was not a paradise, but a tiger's den. And if Eleanor Vance had lost her children 3 times, there was no guarantee that she and the baby she was carrying wouldn't be the next victims. Sophia Miller left the coffee shop in a state of total panic. Eleanor Vance's words swirled in her head like a curse. She immediately called James. Her voice was no longer flirtatious but trembling and accusatory. James was at home. Thinking his wife hadn't returned yet, he went straight to the living room, sat on the sofa, and took the call with complete nonchalance. His entire conversation was recorded in full by the hidden camera in the hydrangea vase. On the other end of the line, Sophia almost screamed, "James, you lied to me. Eleanor Vance found me and told me she had miscarried 3 times. Your mother did it, didn't she? Is it true?" James was startled, stood up, and paced back and forth in the living room, trying to calm his mistress. His voice was a little annoyed, but he tried to be gentle. "Sophia, calm down and listen to me. Why did you meet with her? She just wants to upset us and drive a wedge between us, can't you see?" But Sophia had already lost her reason. She cried uncontrollably over the phone. Drive a wedge? She sounded so miserable. She only talked about her lost children. "I'm so scared, James. Your mother is insane. If she can treat her official daughter-in-law like that, how will she treat me and our son? I don't want my son to be in danger." Fear overcame everything, making Sophia reveal her innermost thoughts. To comfort his panicked mistress, James blurted out words he would later regret. He lowered his voice as if telling a secret. "Listen to me, you silly girl. My mother did that only because she wanted us to have a healthy son for the family legacy. She couldn't carry a child. That's her fault. That will never happen to you because you carry the hope of this whole family. You and she are completely different. You understand?" Eleanor Vance, sitting in her car just around the corner, watched and listened to the entire conversation in silence. James's confession was even clearer and more damning than the audio from his drunken stupor. He not only knew but fully agreed and considered it reasonable. He had clearly classified her and her children as expendable, while Sophia and her fetus were the hope that must be protected. Her heart no longer ached. It had completely frozen over. On the screen, James was still coddling his mistress with sweet promises of a wedding and a bright future. He promised her a new condo, a trip, and that his mother would not bother her. Finally, after a long while, Sophia stopped crying and hung up. James sighed in relief, a look of fatigue and a hint of annoyance on his face. He didn't know that the entire scene and his confession had been recorded by the wife he despised without missing a single detail. Eleanor calmly saved the video. The net she had cast had finally caught the biggest fish. Eleanor Vance chose a Saturday evening when both James and Carol were at home to stage her final scene. She cooked a lavish dinner herself. The atmosphere in the house was deceptively warm and peaceful. James seemed very pleased. He thought his wife had finally resigned herself, letting go of her suspicions after he had comforted her. Carol was no less satisfied. Seeing her daughter-in-law so obedient, she was convinced her plan was on track. They didn't know that this lavish dinner was the last meal of the condemned before heading to the gallows. After dinner was over, Eleanor invited her husband and mother-in-law to have tea in the living room. She sat down calmly, her face expressionless, and said softly, "Mom, James, I've been watching some very interesting movies lately. I think you guys will like to see them too." James frowned, a little confused, while Carol smiled indulgently. "What kind of movie does my daughter-in-law like so much?" Eleanor didn't answer. She silently connected her phone to the large TV screen in the living room. The screen lit up, and the first scene that appeared was their familiar living room. It was the video of James hugging and kissing Sophia Miller right on the sofa where they were sitting. The smile on Carol's lips froze, and James turned pale, paralyzed. He stammered, "Eleanor, this." But Eleanor didn't give him a chance to explain. She calmly switched to the second video. This time, the protagonist was Carol. The scene of her secretly pouring the white powder into Eleanor's bowl was displayed clearly, without any dead angles. The clinking sound of the porcelain spoon stirring the soup echoed in the terrifying silence of the room. The teacup in Carol's hand fell and shattered. Tea splashed everywhere. She trembled, pointing at the screen, her mouth open, unable to say a word. James looked at his mother, then at Eleanor, his eyes filled with extreme panic. But the nightmare wasn't over. Eleanor played the audio of James's drunken confession, followed by the video of him pacing in the living room, talking on the phone with Sophia, admitting all of his mother's crimes and promising a future without his wife. When all the videos and audios were over, the TV screen turned to a deep black, reflecting the pale, panicked faces of James and his mother. A heavy silence, like a rock, settled over the room. Any denial, any excuse, was now useless in the face of the irrefutable evidence. They had been exposed. All the masks of kindness and affection had been torn off, leaving only the rawness of malice and selfishness. Eleanor Vance remained seated, her cold gaze sweeping over the two trembling people in front of her. She stood up slowly, walked to the coffee table, and placed a folder on it. Her voice sounded without fluctuation, without emotion, but firmer and more authoritative than any insult. "The divorce papers are already signed by me. The assets will be divided by law. I have already regained control of my company. This house is in my name. It's my premarital property." She paused, looking directly into James's eyes, then said with emphasis on each word. Her voice contained all the contempt and hatred suppressed for a long time. "Now, I'm asking both of you to leave my house." The terrifying silence in the living room was broken by James's roar. After the initial shock, his panic quickly turned into the fury of a cornered animal. He couldn't believe his always obedient and gentle wife had set such a sophisticated and cruel trap. He pointed a finger at her, the veins on his forehead bulging. His voice was hoarse. "Eleanor Vance, you're insane. Why did you set all this up? You want to destroy this family? You want to destroy me, right?" Eleanor just sneered, a cold, sarcastic smile. "Destroy you, James? The ones who have destroyed this family are you and your mother, not me. I'm just cleaning up the mess you two have created in my own home." Carol had also come to her senses by then. She began to scream, resorting to her usual tactic of playing the victim. "Oh my God, what have I done to deserve a daughter-in-law like this? I've bent over backward for her, cared for her in every detail, and now she falsely accuses me. James, defend me. She wants to kick us out of the house?" James looked at his mother, who was crying her heart out, then at his wife with a look as sharp as a knife. He began to use his last resort. He approached Eleanor, lowered his voice, his words full of threat. "Do you think you can get a divorce so easily? I'm warning you, Eleanor Vance. If you dare to escalate this, I'll make sure you never see the child again. Don't forget, the baby in your womb also carries my last name, Parker." He believed the child was Eleanor's fatal weak point, the trump card that would make her submit. He smiled smugly. "You have no family background. You have no one to back you up. Do you think you can fight me in this family? If I want to, I have 100 ways to prove in court that you're an unfit mother, that you suffer from depression and can't raise the child. By then, you will have lost everything. Do you understand?" These vile threats didn't scare Eleanor. On the contrary, they only increased her disgust for the man in front of her. She looked him straight in the eye. Her gaze was strangely calm, even with a hint of pity. She said slowly, her voice clear, "James Parker, it seems even at this moment you don't understand the problem. The one who needs to be afraid now is not me, but you and your mother." She gently touched her belly, a protective gesture. "You want custody? Fine, we'll see each other in court. Let's see. What right does a father who is an accomplice in a plot to kill his own children and a grandmother who wants to poison her own grandchild have to talk about family and custody? Do you think the evidence I just showed you is just to scare you? A copy is already in my lawyer's office." Eleanor's words fell like a bucket of cold water on James's anger, leaving him stunned. He realized that the woman in front of him was no longer the Eleanor Vance he knew. Eleanor Vance's words were like a sentence that completely shattered James's pride and confidence. He looked at her in amazement, unable to believe that the woman he had always thought was easy to control had prepared everything so meticulously. Just as the silence and tension in the living room reached their peak, the doorbell rang suddenly, a dry, untimely sound. Eleanor showed no surprise. She walked calmly to the door, as if she already knew of this visitor's arrival. The door opened, and Richard Mendez appeared in an elegant suit, his demeanor calm and professional. Behind him, an assistant carried a thick briefcase. Richard's presence was like a final bucket of cold water, extinguishing the last faint spark of hope in the hearts of James and his mother. They realized that Eleanor was not alone. She had solid support, a force they could not underestimate. Richard entered the house, nodded politely to Eleanor, then turned to the two sitting on the sofa, his gaze sharp as if it could see through their souls. He handed them his business card. His voice was not loud or low, but it carried an invisible weight. "Good evening, Mr. Parker, Mrs. Parker. I'm Richard Mendez, Eleanor Vance's attorney. He paused, letting the word attorney sink into their panicked minds. Before continuing, I came today to officially inform you of a few things. We have compiled a complete file of all evidence regarding the act of intentional and systematic battery on a pregnant woman and the conspiracy to appropriate assets by you two. He signaled to the assistant to place the briefcase on the table. The dry click of the briefcase lock opening in the silence echoed like a judge's gavel. Richard took out a stack of documents without showing them, just holding them, as if holding their fate. This evidence, including videos, audio recordings, medical analysis results, and witness statements, is sufficient grounds to initiate a criminal case. According to current law, the act of the lady here can be prosecuted for the crime of aggravated battery and the gentleman's act for being an accomplice in covering up a crime. That's not to mention the issues related to assets and custody that we will clarify in the divorce court. Carol began to tremble, and sweat soaked James's forehead. The dream of getting custody, of making Eleanor leave empty-handed, had vanished. Now the problem was no longer money, but freedom. Richard looked them in the eye, delivering the final blow that would crush all resistance. And just so you don't bother thinking, a copy of this file was sent to the police this afternoon. I believe they will be contacting you soon to start the investigation. My advice at this time is for you to find a lawyer for yourselves. With that said, Richard didn't stay a second longer. He nodded to Eleanor and left with his assistant, leaving behind a ruined battlefield. James and Carol slumped on the sofa, their faces drained of blood. They had lost, and disastrously so. The war had not even begun, but they already knew their fate. Power, money, the things they once considered their supreme weapons were now useless before the net of justice that Eleanor Vance had cast. After Richard left, James and Carol scrambled to gather their personal belongings in a state of extreme panic. There were no more threats, no more crying scenes, only fear. As soon as they got into their luxury car and the door closed, the terrifying silence was broken by Carol's shriek. She turned to hit her son. Her voice was shrill and full of hatred. Useless. It's all your fault. I raised you and educated you for so many years. I handed over the entire business to you, and you can't even control one woman. Now she's going to trample all over us. Are you happy that I'm going to jail? James, who was in a state of extreme stress, exploded at his mother's curses. He pushed her away, shouting with equal resentment, "It's all your fault, Mom. If you hadn't done those evil things, we wouldn't have come to this. I told you 1,000 times to stop, but you wouldn't listen, always thinking only of a male heir, a grandson. Now look, there's no grandson, only jail." He stomped on the accelerator. The car shot off into the night like a wounded animal fleeing. The argument in the car escalated. The mother and son blamed each other. The bitterest words, the long hidden resentments, were unleashed mercilessly. Carol cursed Eleanor as a jinx, and James roared that it was his mother's stupidity and malice that had ruined everything. Driving and arguing with his mother, he paid no attention to the road. The car swerved at high speed, just at a moment of distraction, as he turned to shout at his mother, "It's all because of you." James didn't see the truck pulling out of a side street. The pitiful screech of brakes was followed by a terrible crash. The luxury car was thrown against the median, the front end mangled, with white smoke rising. All the noise of the argument ceased suddenly, leaving only the sound of the fine rain and the shrill honks from onlookers' cars. Eleanor Vance had just changed into comfortable pajamas, preparing to enjoy the first night of peace after long days of tension, when her phone rang. It was an unknown number. She picked it up, and an unfamiliar, serious voice sounded. "Am I speaking to Eleanor Vance? This is the District Traffic Police. Your husband, James Parker, has been in a serious car accident. Please come to the Central Hospital immediately." Eleanor froze. The phone almost slipped from her hand. She no longer felt love or concern, but the news shocked her. Her plan had been interrupted by an unexpected turn. She quickly changed her clothes, took a taxi, and headed to the hospital. The chaos of the emergency room hit her, the smell of disinfectant, the sound of doctors' and nurses' hurried footsteps, the cries of patients' families. It all mixed together in a deafening jumble. She saw 2 gurneys being pushed into the operating room with 2 blood-covered figures. Although she couldn't see their faces, she knew it was James and his mother. Her plan of legal, direct revenge had just taken a different turn, a turn full of chaos and uncertainty. The atmosphere in the Central Hospital's emergency room was chaotic and suffocating. Eleanor Vance sat on the cold row of waiting chairs. Her belly, now noticeable under her coat, made her stand out in the crowd. She had just contacted Richard Mendez to briefly inform him of the situation, and he said he would come immediately. Eleanor felt nothing in particular, no sadness, no joy, just an empty weariness. The play she had directed had an unexpected ending, an ending written by the actors themselves with their own stupidity and rage. Just then, a stylish figure burst into the ER. Her beautiful face was now soaked with tears. It was Sophia Miller. Seeing Eleanor, she lunged toward her like a moth to a flame, her eyes red and swollen, her voice shrill. "Eleanor Vance, it was you. It's all your fault. If you hadn't pushed them so hard, James and his mother wouldn't be like this. You're a wicked witch." The familiar scene of blaming the third party. But Eleanor was in no mood to argue. She simply looked up at Sophia. Her gaze was cold and distant. She said calmly, her voice without fluctuation, "Sophia, this is a hospital, not a marketplace. If you want to know who's right and who's wrong, wait for the police investigation. Right now, the only person with the legal authority to deal with the hospital is me, James Parker's legal wife. Please sit on the side and be quiet." Eleanor's calm and rightful authority left Sophia speechless. She could scream, she could curse, but in the eyes of the law, she was nothing. Just then, the operating room door opened. An elderly doctor came out, his face grave. He took off his mask, looked around, and asked, "Who is the family of James Parker?" Eleanor stood up immediately. "I am, doctor. I'm his wife." The doctor looked at Eleanor's belly, a flicker of sympathy in his eyes. He said grimly, "The patient's condition is very serious. We've done everything we can to save his life, but one of his legs is too crushed, with no possibility of recovery. To save his life and prevent infection and gangrene, we propose to proceed with an immediate amputation of the leg. You are his wife. We need your signature of consent." Both Eleanor and Sophia were stunned. Amputate a leg. That meant James Parker, the man who had always been so vain about his perfect appearance, would become an amputee. Sophia was paralyzed. Her face was paler than a ghost's. Her dream of a handsome, elegant CEO had been shattered. The love she had always proclaimed was now being put to a cruel test. Did she love the man or just his perfect appearance and wealth? In that silence, Eleanor took the pen from the nurse. She didn't hesitate. She signed her name on the surgery consent form decisively and firmly. She did this not out of love or forgiveness. She did it out of human conscience, because she did not want to become the kind of person they were, the kind of person who could ruthlessly take away others' lives. She wanted her child to know that her mother was a person of principle, even in the worst circumstances. She looked up at Sophia, who had collapsed, with cold pity in her heart. Fate sometimes has ways of punishing that are more ironic and bitter than any legal sentence. After Eleanor Vance signed, James was pushed back into the operating room. The red light above the door lit up, signaling that a life was about to change forever. Eleanor and Sophia sat at opposite ends of the waiting room, a heavy, tense silence between them. Richard had already arrived, standing next to Eleanor like a silent protector. His presence made her feel somewhat calmer. Sophia was completely broken, huddled together, sobbing wordlessly from time to time. The rosy future she had imagined had crumbled right before her eyes. She would have to tie herself to a disabled man for life, to a family on the brink of ruin, and face the law. Despair and madness began to invade her immature mind. Suddenly, Sophia burst out laughing, a hysterical, out-of-place laugh in the quiet hospital corridor. She lifted her disheveled head and stared at Eleanor, her eyes full of mockery and venom. "A son. Huh. A son. All you people ever wanted was a son. How ridiculous. So ridiculous." Eleanor and Richard frowned at her, not understanding what she was saying. Sophia stood up shakily and approached Eleanor. Her voice was sharp, screeching, and full of resentment. "You think you've won? Do you know something? This family, this man that you and I fought over, they were willing to do anything cruel, all for a male heir to carry on the name. But it's funny, so funny, you know? She laughed again, tears streaming down her cheeks. Then she suddenly leaned toward Eleanor. Her voice was a whisper, but audible enough for Richard, who was standing beside her, to hear. "There is no son. That sonogram is fake. I paid for it. I deceived him and his mother. I deceived all of you. I just wanted a security ticket to get into that house." This confession exploded like a bomb in the hospital corridor. Eleanor was stunned. Richard couldn't hide his surprise. All the motivation, all the crimes, all the sacrifice and pain of Eleanor turned out to be built on the lie of a scheming girl. Just at that moment, the door of the nearby recovery room opened. A nurse pushed James's gurney to transfer him to the ICU. He had woken up from the surgery. Although he was very weak, he was conscious and had heard Sophia's entire hysterical confession. James's eyes flew wide open. He stared at his mistress. He had just lost a leg. His mother was in a coma, not knowing if she would live or die. His career and freedom were about to vanish, and now he learned that the whole family's hope for which he had sacrificed everything was just a sham. A maddening hatred flashed in James's empty eyes, a hatred even greater than his physical pain. Sophia saw that look. She backed away in fear, realizing she had destroyed her last escape route. Eleanor Vance stood there, witnessing everything in silence. A con artist and a traitor, who were once allies in a cruel conspiracy, had now become mortal enemies. The wheel of karma had turned on its own, crushing them without her having to lift another finger. The divorce trial of Eleanor Vance and James Parker was held in a closed court at Richard Mendez's request to protect his client from media scrutiny, but the atmosphere inside the courtroom was still solemn and heavy. Eleanor, now 7 months pregnant, sat upright on the plaintiff's side. Beside her was Richard, his face calm and professional. On the opposite side, James sat in a wheelchair, one pant leg empty, his face haggard and filled with desperate bitterness. He had lost everything, his health, his career, and his last faith in humanity. Richard didn't need to say much. He methodically and coldly presented each piece of evidence to the court one by one. The video of Carol's poisoning act, the analysis report of the poisonous substance, the video of James being intimate with his mistress and promising a future without his wife. Finally, the irrefutable audio and video of his confession. With each piece of evidence presented, the air in the courtroom became more suffocating. James's lawyer could hardly present any convincing defense, only able to circle around reasons like provocation and loss of control. James sat there, silent as a statue. He no longer had the strength to argue or shout. In the past few days, he had tasted all the bitterness of life. His mother was still in a coma in the hospital. His mistress had blatantly deceived him. His career had collapsed, and his friends had abandoned him. Now he was here, facing the wife he had despised and conspired to harm, realizing how disastrously he had lost. He had lost, not because Eleanor was smarter, but because he and his mother had acted against conscience and morality. After reviewing all the evidence, the judge, a middle-aged woman with a stern look, looked at James with barely concealed disappointment. She finally struck the gavel, her voice clear as she declared the final verdict. Eleanor Vance was granted the divorce. Custody of the child, once born, belonged entirely to the mother. As for the assets, the house and the entire Aura Interior Design Company were determined to be Eleanor's sole property. James Parker had no right to interfere. The rest of the marital assets were divided according to law, but James would have to use his share to compensate Eleanor for emotional and health damages. The sentence was fair and just. As the trial ended, Eleanor and Richard walked out of the courthouse. The sun shone brightly on her, warm and pleasant. She took a deep breath, her lungs filled with the fresh air of freedom. Her hellish marriage was officially over. She had won not only on the legal front but had triumphed over her own weakness, rising above adversity to protect her child and reclaim her own life. Richard looked at her, his eyes shining with tenderness and pride. He said softly, "It's all over, Eleanor. From now on, live well." Eleanor turned to look at him. For the first time in a long time, she smiled genuinely, a smile of relief and serenity. The chains were broken. Although the road ahead might have many challenges as a single mother, she knew she was strong enough to face them all. 2 months after the trial, Eleanor Vance went into labor and was taken to the maternity ward of a luxury hospital that Richard had previously arranged. The contractions were long and intense, but Eleanor gritted her teeth and endured. This physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional pain she had been through. In her mind, there was only one thought. She had to be strong. She had to be safe to welcome her beloved daughter. A mother's strength helped her overcome everything. After many hours of struggle, a tender but clear baby's cry was finally heard, breaking the tension in the delivery room. "Congratulations! It's a very beautiful and healthy baby girl." The nurse smiled, bringing the baby wrapped in a soft blanket for Eleanor to see. The moment she saw her daughter's tiny, rosy face, all of Eleanor's pain disappeared. Her tears welled up, but this time they were tears of happiness and fulfillment. She had done it. She had protected her child until the very end. She reached out a trembling hand to touch her daughter's cheek. This little being was the most precious gift heaven had given her, the motivation to live and fight. Eleanor named her daughter Clara, a name that carried all her faith and gratitude. No matter how humans calculated and conspired with malice, in the end, God's will would put everything in its place. The arrival of her daughter was fate's best arrangement. The following days in the hospital, Richard Mendez was always by her side, taking care of the two of them attentively. He was not her husband or her lover, but he did everything a father and a husband should do. He handled all the paperwork, prepared nutritious meals, and sometimes just sat quietly watching little Clara sleep. His presence gave Eleanor a strange sense of peace and security. He was like a solid lighthouse that appeared just as her ship was faltering in the stormy sea. She was very grateful to him, but for the time being, she just kept that feeling in her heart. Her heart had too many scars. It needed time to heal before she could think about a new relationship. She wanted to devote all her love and attention to her little daughter. With her daughter in her arms, Eleanor felt absolute peace. She realized her real victory was not the moment James and his mother paid the price, but this very instant, the moment she could hold her daughter, watch her sleep, feel the sacred bond of motherhood. Her happiness no longer depended on anyone else. It was here, in her arms, simple, pure, and priceless. One beautiful sunny afternoon, Eleanor sat by the hospital room window, watching her daughter sleep in the bassinet. Richard was sitting in the armchair opposite, a law book in his hand, but his eyes never left the mother and daughter. The atmosphere was quiet and warm. The storm had truly passed, leaving a blue sky and a new life growing strongly. Her new life, their new life, had officially begun. Time passed quietly after Eleanor Vance left the hospital. She devoted herself entirely to taking care of little Clara. Her world had shrunk, revolving only around her daughter's cries, laughter, and the sweet smell of milk. She had almost forgotten the existence of those people and those old affairs. Until one day, Richard visited and brought with him the latest information about them. He sat in the living room, watching Eleanor skillfully prepare milk for her daughter with an unconfessable tenderness in his eyes. He waited until she finished feeding her and put her to bed before he started talking. He said in a monotonous voice, as if reporting a case, "Eleanor, Carol's criminal case has a preliminary result. She woke up from the coma, but due to the severe brain injury, she is paralyzed on the left side of her body and her speech is no longer clear." The court considered her health condition, but with the irrefutable evidence of repeated, intentional battery, she will still face an appropriate prison sentence. She will likely spend the rest of her life in the prison infirmary. The obsession with a perfect legacy finally ended with her own imperfection. Perhaps it is fate's most ironic punishment. Eleanor listened silently. She felt no joy, only a void. This woman had caused her so much suffering, but now, hearing that she was paying the price, she did not feel happy. Perhaps because she had completely emerged from that mire. What happened to those who remained trapped no longer mattered to her, she asked calmly. "And the others?" Richard continued. "Sophia had a miscarriage after the extreme emotional trauma. James, in a fit of hatred over the deception, has completely disowned her, not giving her a single penny of support. It seems she had to go back to her hometown, facing the scorn of her family and neighbors. Her future life will be very difficult. A young woman who gambled her entire future on a game of lies and ultimately lost everything. Eleanor just sighed softly. That was the path Sophia had chosen. And James Parker. Richard paused for a moment, looking at Eleanor. He sold all his remaining stock in the family company to pay for the hospital bills and your compensation. He now lives alone in a small apartment, with almost no contact with anyone. The physical disability, the collapse of his career, and the betrayal of both his mother and his mistress have turned him into a shadow of his former self. A CEO who once controlled everything, now he is just a lonely, disabled man, consumed by regret and bitterness. After hearing everything, Eleanor was silent for a long time. She did not comment on their fate. Life has its own laws of cause and effect. He who sows the wind reaps the whirlwind, it is a fair rule. She turned to look at her daughter, sleeping peacefully in the crib. Her little lips moved slightly. Her eyes turned soft and warm. The past was truly over. The day of the wicked's downfall had come, but for her, it was just a normal day in her new life, a life of peace and her daughter's laughter. A year later, Eleanor Vance's life had turned a new, radiant, and vibrant page. The interior design firm, Aura Interior Design, under her direct leadership, had prospered tremendously. Eleanor, with her innate talent and insight, had taken the company to a new level with innovative, large-scale projects. The image of a beautiful, talented, strong, and independent female CEO often appeared in business magazines, becoming a source of inspiration for many women. She was no longer anyone's shadow. She was the sun of her own life. Her greatest joy after a stressful day at work was coming home to little Clara. The girl was now over a year old, babbling her first words and taking her first steps. Her daughter's clear laughter and hugs were the medicine that healed all the wounds in Eleanor's heart. She devoted all her free time to her daughter, reading to her, playing with her, exploring the world together. Seeing her daughter grow day by day, healthy and happy, Eleanor knew that all her past decisions had been correct. Richard Mendez, from his role as a lawyer, had gradually become an indispensable friend in the mother and daughter's life. He didn't come over often, so as not to disturb them, but he always appeared just when they needed him. Sometimes, on weekends, he would drop by with a new toy for Clara or some delicious food he knew Eleanor liked. Little Clara adored him, always calling him Uncle Richard and clinging to him whenever he came. The relationship between Eleanor and Richard developed naturally and warmly. There were no romantic, high-flown words between them, only understanding and sincere concern. He understood what she had been through, so he always maintained an appropriate distance, giving her enough space but also close enough for her to feel protected. Eleanor also sensed his affection but didn't rush things. Her heart still needed more time to be truly ready for a new beginning. She wanted to devote all her love and mind to her little daughter. One weekend evening, Richard stayed for dinner with the two of them. After dinner, he sat on the floor, patiently teaching little Clara how to stack wooden blocks. Eleanor sat on the sofa with a book in her hand, but her eyes never left that warm picture. The soft yellow light in the living room illuminated the man playing tenderly with her daughter, creating a moving scene of peace. She suddenly realized that it had been a long time since her heart had felt such a gentle vibration. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew she was no longer afraid. She had found inner peace. She had found happiness in the simplest things. Seeing Richard's radiant smile and Clara's soft laughter, Eleanor smiled involuntarily. The door to her heart, which had been covered in ice, seemed to be slowly opening to welcome the first warm rays of sunshine. The relationship between Eleanor Vance and Richard Mendez continued in a quiet way, like a small stream meandering through the rocks. It wasn't noisy, but it was very steady. He remained a friend, a loving uncle to Clara, a strong shoulder she could rely on. But Eleanor knew there was something more between them, an invisible bond that was becoming clearer and clearer. She felt it in his warm eyes when he looked at the mother and daughter, in his small but subtle acts of affection, in the infinite patience he devoted to her. She didn't avoid it, but she wasn't ready to put a name on it either. One beautiful weekend, Richard proposed taking the mother and daughter on a picnic to a nature preserve on the outskirts of the city. He had prepared everything, from the picnic blanket, a basket of lavish food, to Clara's favorite toys. Under the shade of the trees on the green lawn, the three of them spent a truly happy afternoon. Richard patiently taught Clara to identify different types of flowers and played chase with her. Clara's clear laughter and his deep laugh mingled, creating the happiest melody Eleanor had ever heard. Eleanor sat on the blanket, watching them silently. At that moment, she thought that this was probably the picture of the complete family she had always longed for. A loving husband, an adorable daughter, a quiet afternoon without storms. When Clara got tired and fell asleep in her mother's arms, the space between the two adults fell silent. Richard sat beside her, his eyes looking into the distance, at the shimmering lake, and he suddenly spoke, his voice deep and sincere. "Eleanor, there's something I've wanted to tell you for a long time. Actually, since our college days, you've always caught my eye. That smart, talented, and always enthusiastic architecture student left a deep impression on me." Eleanor was frozen, her heart skipped a beat. She never imagined that the mentor she respected so much had feelings for her. For so long, she was so confused she didn't know what to say. Richard turned to look at her, his eyes full of deep tenderness. "I know this may not be the right time, and I don't want to be a replacement for anyone in your past. I just want you to know that my feelings for you are sincere. I've waited for many years, and I'm willing to wait longer until you're truly ready. I just hope you can give me a chance to be your partner, to protect you, and to bring happiness to you and your daughter." Richard's sincere, belated declaration of love deeply moved Eleanor. Tears rolled down her cheeks. She wasn't crying out of sadness, but because she felt cherished and loved in a pure way. She shook her head gently, her voice slightly choked. Thank you, Richard. I really appreciate your feelings, but I'm sorry, my heart still needs more time." Richard smiled kindly, raised his hand, and gently wiped the tear from her cheek. "It's okay. I understand. I'll wait." His promise wasn't loud or insistent, but it made Eleanor feel absolute peace and trust. A few weeks after the declaration of love in the park, Eleanor Vance was still trying to sort out the confusing feelings in her heart. She knew Richard was a good man, a wonderful father figure to Clara, and perhaps an ideal husband, but the wounds of the past were still there. They were like a ghost that sometimes returned, preventing her from fully opening her heart. Just as she was lost in her thoughts, she received a call from a strange but strangely familiar number. It was James Parker's number. She had blocked him long ago, but he had used another number to contact her. After a moment's hesitation, Eleanor decided to answer. On the other end of the line was a hoarse, tired voice, without the slightest trace of the man's former arrogance. "Eleanor, it's me." Eleanor remained silent, not responding. James continued, his voice sounding like a plea. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I just want to ask you for one thing. Please, let me see the child once, just once from a distance. I swear I won't disturb you two." His plea made Eleanor feel complex. One part of her wanted to refuse outright. She didn't want her daughter to have any connection with such a terrible father. But another part felt a vague pity. After all, he was still Clara's biological father. That was an unchangeable truth. She didn't want Clara, when she grew up, to reproach her for being too cruel, depriving her of the right to know her father. That evening, she told Richard about the situation. He listened attentively, without showing any jealousy or discomfort. He just held her hand, his voice full of respect. "This is a matter between you and Clara, Eleanor. Whatever your decision is, I will support you. If you agree, I will accompany you at a safe distance to make sure you and the child have no problems. You don't have to face this alone." His understanding and unconditional support greatly comforted Eleanor. After a long night of reflection, Eleanor decided to give James a chance. She did this not for him, but for herself and her daughter. She wanted to face the past one last time so she could completely let it go without any attachment. She also wanted that when Clara grew up and asked about her father, she could answer serenely that she had not prevented it, but that he himself had lost his right to be a father. She sent a text message to James, agreeing to meet at an outdoor cafe in a park on the weekend. She chose a public, crowded place to ensure absolute safety. With the phone in her hand after sending the message, Eleanor took a deep breath. She knew this was the last time she would allow the past to return. After this meeting, the door named James Parker would be forever closed in her life. On the agreed weekend, Eleanor Vance pushed Clara's stroller, slowly entering the outdoor cafe in the park. Richard, as promised, had arrived earlier and chosen a table in another corner, far enough not to disturb the meeting but close enough to intervene if necessary. Eleanor saw him, nodded briefly to reassure him, then headed to the empty table she had reserved. James Parker was already sitting there. He was in his wheelchair, thin, his face haggard, his beard unshaven. He looked like a shadow of his former self. In contrast to a radiant, vibrant Eleanor Vance, the contrast became even more cruel. When he saw Eleanor approaching with her daughter's stroller, James's previously empty eyes lit up a little, but were quickly covered by guilt and pain. He didn't dare to look directly at Eleanor. His eyes were fixed on the small body sleeping peacefully in the stroller. It was his daughter, a life he had indirectly consented to destroy. Silence settled over the small table. Eleanor said nothing, just sat quietly and ordered an orange juice. James also remained silent. He just sat there, extending a trembling hand as if wanting to touch his daughter, but then pulled it back, not daring. Time passed slowly. James sat like a statue, staring at his daughter. He was probably trying to find a trace of himself in the small face, or perhaps he was immersed in late regret. Eleanor didn't speak either. She had nothing to say to this man. All the hatred, all the resentment seemed to have dissolved after all the events. Now, seeing her ex-husband in this deplorable state, she only felt that he was a stranger, a person worthy of pity but not forgiveness. Then she saw, on the haggard face of James Parker, a hot tear roll down and fall onto his worn-out pants. A tear of regret, of irreparable loss. He had had everything in his hands, a talented and beautiful wife, a family, a career, but he had destroyed it all himself. Perhaps only at this moment did he truly realize what he had lost. Feeling that the meeting had been enough, Eleanor stood up slowly, not saying goodbye, just nodding slightly at James, a nod that did not mean forgiveness, but simply an end. Then she turned around, pushing Clara's stroller, her back straight, her steps firm. She did not look back. She knew that the greatest forgiveness was not to say it out loud, but to let the past sleep and live a good life in the present. She didn't need to forgive him. She just needed to free herself from the burden of the past. As she walked away, the warm afternoon sunlight shone on her shoulder, creating a radiant aura. She walked towards Richard, who stood up and waited for her, smiling. The past was truly left behind. The last door leading to the painful memory had been gently and decisively closed by herself. As Eleanor Vance approached with the stroller, Richard didn't ask about the meeting. He simply came to her side, his voice as soft as a spring breeze. "Do you want to take a walk? The air in the park is very nice today." Eleanor nodded. She needed a moment of calm to sort out her thoughts. The meeting, though brief, had had a great impact. It was like a final gust of wind that blew away the last remaining dust in her heart. She felt light, wonderfully serene. They walked side by side along the small gravel path under the arches of green trees. Little Clara had woken up. Her dark eyes looked around curiously. The silence between them was not awkward. On the contrary, it was full of understanding. After a long while, it was Eleanor who broke the silence. She looked at Richard, her eyes sincere and a little embarrassed. "Richard, about what you told me at the picnic, I've thought about it a lot." Richard stopped. He turned to look at her with a flicker of hope in his eyes, but still tried to remain calm so as not to pressure her. Eleanor took a deep breath, as if gathering all her courage to say the words that came from the bottom of her heart. "I was very scared. I was afraid of trusting a man again. The old wounds were too deep, and they made me think I could never love again." She looked up and met his eyes, her cheeks slightly flushed, her voice a little shaky but immensely firm. "But over time, your sincerity, patience, and warmth made me realize that not all men are the same." She met his gaze, her cheeks flushed, her voice slightly trembling but very firm. "And I realized I have feelings for you too. I don't know when it started. Maybe it was when you always showed up when I needed you most. Or maybe it was when I saw the way you played so tenderly with Clara. I just know that by your side, I feel peaceful and secure." Eleanor's confession left Richard stunned for a moment, and then immense joy flooded his eyes. He said nothing. He slowly reached out and took her hand. The warmth of his palm transmitted, warming her entire heart. They found a nearby stone bench and sat down, their hands still intertwined. Richard looked at her. His voice was emotional. "Eleanor, thank you. Thank you for giving me and yourself a chance." They sat together, watching little Clara, who was curiously trying to reach for a fallen yellow leaf. They made no grand promises or passionate gestures. A simple handshake and a look of understanding were enough to say it all. The sun slowly set, dyeing the entire park a warm orange. Together, they pushed Clara's stroller home. The shadows of the two of them stretched out on the path, intertwining, creating a picture of a happy and peaceful family. Eleanor Vance knew she was taking the firmest steps towards happiness, a happiness she fully deserved. A quiet, lasting happiness built on the foundation of respect and sincere love. After the sincere declaration of love and the warm handshake in the park, the relationship of Eleanor Vance and Richard Mendez entered a new phase. It was no longer friendship, nor a passionate love, but a deep, lasting affection. He became an indispensable part of the mother and daughter's daily life. He didn't move in with them, but almost every evening he came for dinner, helped her clean up, played with Clara, and left after the little girl fell asleep. He did everything naturally and measuredly, which made Eleanor feel very comfortable and respected. For little Clara, Uncle Richard's presence had become a familiar and joyful thing. In her small world, Uncle Richard was the person who could throw her into the air and catch her safely, the one who patiently spent hours assembling complex models, the one with a deep voice who told the best fairy tales. She adored him, trusted him unconditionally. Eleanor smiled happily seeing this bond, secretly thanking fate for bringing this man into her life. One evening, as the three of them were playing together on the living room rug, Clara was trying to stack a tall tower with wooden blocks, but it kept falling over. The little girl looked frustrated, pouting. Richard smiled, took a larger block, put it as the base, and said gently to the girl, "Sweetheart, we need to build a very solid base so the tower won't fall down. Try again, okay?" Clara looked at him. Then she looked at the block, seeming to understand. She picked up another block, but instead of placing it herself, she lifted her large, round eyes to Richard, holding out the block with her small hand, and then a tender but clear sound came from her small mouth. "Daddy." Both Eleanor and Richard froze, almost breathless. Clara, seeing that he didn't react, called out again with a more impatient tone, more clearly, "Daddy, stack!" At that moment, time seemed to stand still. Richard felt his heart being enveloped by a warm wave, an intense emotion he had never experienced. He had waited for this day, but he didn't expect it to come so suddenly and so sweetly. He leaned down and hugged the little girl tightly, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Yes, Daddy's here. Daddy will stack it for you." Eleanor, sitting opposite, witnessed everything. Tears rolled down her cheeks. They were tears of fulfillment. Clara's call of Daddy was not just a word. It was a recognition. The purest approval from a child's innocent soul proved that Richard's sincere love had been felt and reciprocated by her daughter. It was also the affirmation that their small family, a family rebuilt from the rubble, was now truly complete. Richard hugged Clara, lifted his head to look at Eleanor. His eyes also shone with tears. He smiled at her, a smile of indescribable happiness. Eleanor smiled back at him through her tears. They had a family, a real family. Clara's call of Daddy became the most powerful catalyst, breaking the last remaining barrier in Eleanor Vance's heart. The relationship between her and Richard became closer and more natural than ever. He no longer left every night. He had become the man of the family, sharing with her all the joys and sorrows, caring for and raising Clara together. Eleanor's life was now filled with laughter and warmth, a simple happiness she had thought she would never achieve. One night, on the anniversary of when they officially started being together, after Clara fell asleep, they sat on the windy balcony, enjoying a glass of wine. Under the romantic yellow light, they reminisced about the journey they had taken. Eleanor rested her head on Richard's shoulder. Her voice was a little dreamy. Sometimes I still can't believe how things have changed. I remember perfectly the desperate feeling of that day when I discovered the strange perfume on James's jacket. If it hadn't been for that coincidence, maybe Clara and I wouldn't be so peaceful now. Richard was silent for a moment, put down his wine glass, hugged her tighter, looked into her eyes, his voice deep and with a hint of hesitation. Eleanor, actually, your discovery of the truth wasn't entirely a coincidence. Eleanor was surprised, lifted her head to look at him. What do you mean? Richard took a deep breath, as if preparing to reveal a long-held secret. He didn't want to deceive her, not even about a small thing. He told her that since their college days, he had always secretly followed her. He had buried that feeling because he knew she already had someone in her heart. After graduation, they lost contact, but he still received news about her through some mutual friends. Once, at a social reception for lawyers and entrepreneurs, he happened to see James with a very beautiful young girl, and their gestures were unusually intimate. His gut told him something bad was happening. He was very worried about Eleanor. He wondered what he should do. He couldn't tell her directly without proof. It would be too abrupt and might put her in a difficult situation. But if he did nothing, he was afraid she would get hurt. Richard looked at her, his eyes full of sincerity. So, I did something that was maybe a little nosy. I used a fake email to send you a very short, anonymous message with just one line. Pay attention to your mother-in-law's soups. Eleanor was completely stunned. She remembered that she had indeed received a strange email around that time. At that time, she thought it was junk mail, or that someone had sent it by mistake and deleted it without much thought. But that vague warning had planted a seed of doubt in her heart, making her more sensitive to the unusual signs later on, from the seat position to the perfume smell. It turned out that her protector had not appeared when she sought him out, but had been there long before, silently and anonymously. She looked at the man beside her, her heart flooded with an indescribable emotion. It was astonishment, gratitude, and above all, a deep love. He was not the prince who appeared at the end of the story to rescue the princess, but the knight who had secretly guarded her castle even before the storm came. Eleanor said nothing, just wrapped her arms around his neck, hiding her face in his strong chest, and tears fell again. Thank you, Richard. Thank you for everything. After the night, Richard confessed the secret of the anonymous email. The love Eleanor Vance felt for him became deeper and more complete. She realized that her destiny seemed to have been sealed a long time ago. He was her benefactor, her protector, sent by heaven into her life. Her life continued in days of simple happiness. He was a perfect partner, a wonderful father. He took her and Clara to the park. He read stories to her daughter every night. He shared her work pressures and the small joys of life. One late autumn afternoon, Richard told her he wanted to take her to a special place. He had asked a trusted nanny to take care of Clara for a few hours. Eleanor was curious but happily agreed. He drove to the waterfront. The sun was slowly setting, dyeing the entire sky, and the river a romantic orange. The lights of the skyscrapers on the other side of the river began to light up, creating a beautiful and magnificent landscape. They walked hand in hand along the riverbank. The cool breeze blew gently, bringing with it the chill of the water. When they stopped at a spot with a panoramic view, Richard suddenly turned to look at her, his eyes deep and full of intense affection. He took both her hands, his voice deep and sincere. Eleanor, do you know? During the darkest years of my life, when I thought I had lost the woman I loved most, your image gave me the motivation to keep going. I told myself I had to be strong. I had to be successful so that one day, if we had the chance to meet again, I could have the right to stand by your side and protect you. Eleanor's heart was deeply moved by his words. He continued, and now that you are really by my side, I feel like the luckiest man in the world. I don't want to promise you big things. I just want to promise you one thing. I will use the rest of my life to bring peace and laughter to you and Clara. I will build a solid fortress so that no storm can ever harm you two again. With that said, in front of Eleanor's astonished and emotional gaze, Richard slowly knelt down on one knee, took out a dark blue velvet box from his pocket, opened it, and inside was an exquisitely and elegantly designed diamond ring. The sparkle of the diamonds mingled with the city lights, creating a mesmerizing beauty. He looked up at her, his eyes full of love and expectation. "Eleanor Vance, will you marry me so that I can spend my whole life taking care of you and our daughter?" Tears of happiness streamed down Eleanor's cheeks. She couldn't speak, only able to nod repeatedly. She had been through a long, dark, and cold winter, and now this man had brought all the warmth of spring into her life. Richard was overjoyed. He carefully placed the ring on her ring finger and stood up to hug her tightly. Under the glowing sunset, with the entire beautiful city as a witness, they shared a deep kiss, a kiss that testified to a love that had overcome all trials and found a safe harbor. The wedding of Eleanor Vance and Richard Mendez was held shortly after. It was not an extravagant ceremony but a warm party on the beach. Only their closest friends attended. Eleanor did not choose wedding dresses from famous brands. She designed her own immaculate white wedding dress. The style was simple but extremely elegant, radiating the mature, sophisticated, and happy beauty of a woman who had overcome the storm. It was not just a dress. It was the story, the reincarnation of herself. On that great day, the most important main character was not the bride or the groom, but a little angel named Clara. The little girl in her pink princess dress was as pretty as a flower, and she was the one who brought the rings to her father and mother. As she toddled down the aisle covered with rose petals, carrying the ring box towards them, all the guests were moved to tears. That image was more beautiful than any vow. It was the most vivid testimony of a happy family built on sincere love. Standing on the altar, under an arch of romantic white flowers, Richard held Eleanor's hand tightly. He looked at her, his eyes full of love and appreciation. The vows he spoke were not poetic words, but simple words that came from the bottom of his heart. "Thank you for coming to me, bringing light and spring with you. From today on, Eleanor Vance and Clara will be my two sweetest responsibilities and my two most precious possessions." Eleanor smiled through her tears. She knew she had found the right man, a man who would love her daughter as his own. The party went on in a cheerful and warm atmosphere. There were no cumbersome procedures, only sincere wishes, infectious laughter, and free dancing on the sand. As night fell, Eleanor stood looking at the vast ocean. Richard came up from behind, gently placing a thin shawl over her shoulders. He hugged her, listening together to the gentle sound of the waves. Eleanor leaned against his strong chest, feeling absolute peace. She had once resented fate, had been submerged in pain and despair. But now, looking back, she felt grateful. Grateful for the storms that had made her stronger and more resilient. Grateful for the stumbles that had helped her realize the value of true happiness, and grateful that life had not been so cruel, bringing Richard and Clara to her side, compensating her for everything she had lost. She looked at the man beside her, who had loved her patiently and generously, and then looked at her daughter playing with other children, her heart filled with complete happiness. Happiness may come late, but once it arrives, it is more radiant than any dawn.